Right, so here we're going to talk a little bit about animation and particularly post effects after you've done a rendering to do a little bit more with it. In this case, it's a looping animation, and it kind of started by accident. Let me go back. Let me undo all this. Let me, in fact, get out of this. Let me restore the original. This is the original rendering. I think maybe I had another one even before that. It's pretty high resolution. Let's see if I think it was 4,000 pixels wide. Let's see image info. No, that's not the one. That's I already cropped this one, so it must be maybe it's this one. Let's restore this. Oh yeah, that's much bigger. Okay, so here's an animation that I created. The original sky is from Saya, I think, or I forget her name. She's on Pixels, and there are some great pictures that you can use for free, even some of them for commercial use. So with much appreciation, pexels.com. And what you can do is, in this case, I used it as the background image in my rendering. And I forgot to set the keyframe for the position forward. So I wanted to kind of move into this scene. But then when I played it, I realized that the camera was not moving. I didn't move the camera. But I still have animation because the water plane, the water is animated by itself, right? No matter what you do, if you have the water plane in Puppy Ray enabled, visible, the waves are going to move. And you can change the speed of that and the elevation, the height of the waves and that sort of thing, but there's going to be some movement. So what I wanted to do is turn this into at least a looping animation, right? So the first thing I did is to decide perhaps to make it a little bit smaller, right? So if you look at that, you can simply go to resample, and I do this not because I need to. It's more because okay, it's going to make things a little bit faster just to test it, and maybe because I really don't have a need for it to be what is this one 4,000 pixels wide, 4,096, pretty high resolution. And so if I wanted that, especially if it's going to be a background picture, maybe a looping one, you don't need it super high resolution if you decide to blur it, because maybe you put this in a game and you don't want to have it take away the focus from what's happening in the foreground, right? You're going to have some characters or some dinosaurs or something, a UFO landing in the foreground, and the background may even be blurry a little bit. So you don't need it at super high resolution, but you could. What I'm going to do though is just to show the steps possibly you may want to explore. One is to make it a little bit smaller. So I'm going to resample it. Now there's a couple of different ways to resample it, right? First of all, you may want to lock the width and the height together so it keeps the same aspect ratio. And let's say we need this at full HD. On the width, it's 1920, but this image is actually not exactly the same aspect ratio. So I could adjust that here. Let's unlock it now and say perhaps 888, something like that. So it's one of the numbers that is relatively well covered with many of the video formats. 720 would be another one. There's a whole range of different possibles. Another thing you might do even before that is to actually crop to a portion of interest. Maybe you don't want that much of the sky. Maybe you want, the 2/3, 1/3 ratio on the picture. So maybe just the lower third. So you could take the the rectangle selection and say, okay, I need about this much, right? So that part is what you're going to focus on with the rectangle selection. You could even go with a smaller section, something like this. Why is it not highlighting? Let's deselect everything first. Okay, there's something else. Oh, maybe because it's still animating and I'm playing it. Okay, yeah, I don't see it that way. Okay, now I see it. So when I play it, maybe I don't want to keep the whole image, right? Maybe I only want a portion of it. And in fact, super wide aspect ratio, or maybe more of a square. That's where you have a little bit of a choice because we rendered this at a fairly high resolution. There's some nice margins to play with. So what I'm going to do is, let's say we use this, right? And maybe a little bit more. There you go, something like that. So I'm going to go crop the image with to the selection. and that is going to crop every frame. So we have the whole video clip now cropped. It's still a fairly high resolution. You can see it still fills in more than 1920 pixels, and maybe at that point, first of all, I'm going to store that under the animation menu, store to disk. So you have a snapshot to go back to in case you lose it. I'm going to store the others away here. So let's make sure we have the dimensions we roughly want now that we have cropped. So resample it and check. Yeah, see, it's still 3000 wide, 15. So let's set the aspect ratio and see what would it be if we had 720 on the vertical, 1372, or the other way around if we did 1920. 1008, it's not 1080. You know what? It's such a small step. We could actually scale it up a little bit, 1080, and bring it up to that. I think nobody will notice that it's been torn a little bit vertically because it's such a small amount, and frankly, it still looks good. It still will, right? So we can use that. There is only one question: how quickly you want this done. And so the nearest neighbor is the fastest way. Might look a little bit blocky. Bilinear, bilinear plus, and then bicubic, there's just a little bit of a difference in the algorithm, or a bit difference, and it will take a little bit more time. I'm going to go faster for the sake of the exercise being done a little bit faster. So now it's scaling it each image, and once that's done, we have the animation, but it's not guaranteed to be looping yet, right? So we have an animation that's a fairly decent dimensions now. I think it's full HD. Let's double check that. Image info. Yep, 1920 by 1080. That's definitely one worth saving, and I would at least go to the animation and store it to disk. But of course, you can also export it to media or something like that. All right, so next thing we want to do is play this and make sure it's loopable. And because it's mostly noise on the water, you may not notice when it's jumping from the last frame back to the first frame, right? In fact, you can go there to the last frame or close, and then click this one to go back to the first frame. And as you do that, you see it's moving, but you can't tell that it's really a big jump or anything like that. It's not much different than the water movement anyway. So it's almost like you don't need to do anything in this particular case about making it loopable. But if there was a little bit more of a distinction from the last frame to the first frame, you would want to make it loopable. You can right-click the film strip here and say make loopable, or find that from the animation menu. Same here, frames, make loopable. No, wait here. Somewhere in there. Where is it? It's probably on the frames. This is a frame operation. There you go. Make loopable, right? So that's the same menu. This menu here, you see here, the frames menu. If you right-click on the frames, the film strip here, you can see the same menu. So here's make loopable. And what that does is it essentially says that some of the pictures, some of the frames at the end and the ones at the beginning are going to be overlapping. It's going to do a blending transition. And so you can say how many you have how many, like 53 frames total. I'm now here on frame 52, the last one, starting at 0. Well, 2 is at least the minimum I need to sacrifice here, so to overlap. So you would probably not do more than half, but it really depends on how many frames you want to keep in the end. And you can always further expand it or stretch it later on again. So let's go and do something like 40 or something like that, 44 frames. Okay, that. So now we have 44 frames, and it is a little bit more loopable. So at this point, what else can we do? Well, first of all, we need to store that again. Animation, store to disk. There's another thing that I typically would do now is perhaps, do you see the selection mask here? Because we did the cropping. Let's go get rid of that. One thing that you'll probably want to do is give it a little bit more additional movement, right? What I'm saying is, this looks nice, but let's say if this is part of a scene where I'm running through this desert, maybe I'm on Mars, I'm the other Martian, and I've just reached this place where we discovered there actually is liquid water on Mars. We need to be breathing, right? So I'm breathing, and maybe I did some jogging or something. I'm physically exercised, and now I'm breathing and looking at this scene. I need to show a little bit of movement. Not a lot. I'm not turning my head. I'm just like breathing. And when I do that, I need to have the scene go up and down. So one way to do that is you go to the timeline. And in the timeline, you can scrub through that, and you can select a filter to move it. There's actually two that could be used. There are two filters that you could use for that. If you click the filter menu here, click three times on the on the scroll bar. Three times brings you down to the transform group, and there is a shift and a transform. So if we think we only need to shift it up and down to simulate that breathing, that's fine. But we will see easily as we move down a little bit, we'll see the seam at the top, or we'll see it at the bottom as we move down. So that's not the one we want. We need a little bit more margin, and the transform has the same filter issue. I mean the seam issue, even though we could tile it here, but it's still going to show that. The difference though is that we can actually also zoom in. We can scale it up a little bit, right? Then that gives us some margin, so we don't actually notice the edge if we don't move too much. And we really only need to move a little bit. So let's go reset that. And what we'll do on the timeline here, we'll go to the first. And by the way, if you have many here and you need it a little bit more granular, you can either zoom in here with the plus and minus, or you can grab the edge and scale it out a little bit so you have a little bit more granularity on that. So what we'll do is we'll go to the first frame, and instead of keeping it at 100% scale, we'll just go in a little bit, like 102 or even 101 is probably good enough. So I'm gonna go. Let's go with 102 and scale it, and then keep a keyframe here. Right, so we have a keyframe here where it's a little bit scaled in, and then we go to the very end and we don't change anything here. We'll just do another keyframe. That way we guarantee that the last frame and the first frame are in the same transformation state, right? So same position, same scale, and so on. And then the only thing we need to do is somewhere along the middle here, breathe in, move up a little bit, right? So we'll take this here and move it one way or another. You can go right here and set the value. Let's say we want to go up by 1. Right. If you go too high, let's say by 5, you will start seeing the seam. So be careful. And really, there's not much movement needed. 2 may already be too much. It may look like, oh, you're doing more than breathing. Maybe you're standing on your tippy toes or something like that. So, well, which is what I'm doing since I'm recovering from my Achilles tendon rupture, but that's to strengthen the muscles. So now we don't need to do that. So I'm going to go just a little bit and keyframe that. And let's say you wanted to breathe in quickly and then let it have more time to breathe out. What you can do is you move that keyframe, grab the keyframe and move it along the timeline. Right. So now you have a movement going up a little bit faster and then down very slowly. Right. And if in fact you like that, let's try that. Let's apply and make sure you check this box here, save undo, because each frame of the current animation will be put aside as a backup before it applies the filter. And then you can always undo it, but you only have one chance, one level of undo within the animation sequence here. So make sure you keep that and check it, and if you like it, then you can continue. So let's apply that. So now it's scaled in, always the same scale level, 101, 101%. But the movement, now you can play it right here, or you can play it up here too. Now you see there's a little bit of movement, right? But it's going up fairly quickly, and then it's going down slower, and that's because indeed we did this here, right? We have a short amount of a small number of frames, a short amount of time going this way, and then longer, more frames going the other way. And perhaps that's not what we want. So what you do, first of all, you undo the animation. So it restores the original that you see down here. Let's go bring this back down to the default size. So you can see no movement on the terrain itself, no shifting up and down. But of course, still the water movement, the animation is that way. But now what we can do is we can grab this keyframe and move it on the other end. So we have a slower build up and then a quick exhale, right? You breathe in slowly and then exhale fast. And I'm going to overdo it a little bit. I'm going to exaggerate it so it's really easily seen. So let's go and apply that. Again, with the save undo checked. So we have a safe place to go back to. And so now you can see, Okay, now it looks pretty interesting. And so now we have a little bit more of that movement. And let's say this is not perfect yet. Let's say we wanted it even a little bit more even. So what we'll do is one more time we undo that, and we simply move this roughly here and apply that. All right, so let's say that's it, but it's not it yet. All right, let's say we want to actually now, let's say that's it here. Let's say we, first of all, we store this again, store animation to disk, keep a safe copy of it here. So we have this animation, and we have a little bit of a movement. It's loopable. It is looping. One more thing we might want to do. What else could we do? Well, perhaps a little bit of contrast, a little bit of color change, a little bit. There's tons of filters here. Maybe some sharpening. In Howler 2022, there's a new sharpen option. It's called the high pass sharpen. And what I'm going to do is simply experiment with that a little bit. It's pretty intense, right? You can see it's almost like turning into high dynamic range. I mean, to me as a non-expert, it looks a little bit like, oh, wow, look at that. So it's interesting. It looks like indeed from another planet, if that's what this picture is supposed to represent, right? So what you do is you adjust it to the way you like it. And you could even apply a mask to perhaps apply the sharpening only in the front end and keep it a little bit more blurry on the back end. So you could do a selection mask, even a moving selection mask. If you set it up, that will be a different tutorial. But you can have it so that it applies now with Animate to every single frame. Right? So every single frame is undergoing that transformation. And then there's one more thing we might do on occasion. Let's say this is an animation that lasts 1 second or 1.5 seconds, because we have 44 frames, and I think, let's double check on that. Let's see how many frames. When we go to the last one, is number 43. So yeah, we have 44 frames. And when we play it at, I don't know, 24 frames per second, it's going to take a little bit less than 2 seconds. Right, and we may want to make it a little bit slower. So you could do now this time that motion interpolation, motion estimated interpolation. So let's go do that as well. So I'm going to store that one and then say, okay, let's do the motion estimation. Let's do filter. This one is part of the animated category, and we have the motion prediction module right here. So with the motion prediction module, you got to be careful not to go into too much memory, but I think we're still good here. We have, you can check actually how much memory it takes. We have 44 frames. If we were to create a new animation for 44 frames, we put that in here at this current dimension, whatever the width and the height is, it will take only 261 megabytes. And we got plenty, right? This is a 32-bit application. We can go to 10 times as much, almost like 2 gigabytes. So I'm going to go and say it's safe for the animated motion prediction module. And first, let's do a dry run. Let's not scan for dropped frame. There is no need for that. There are no dropped frames in this one. And let's do a test where we do 2 or 3 tweens. And what that basically means is going to be about 3 times as many frames, right? 4 times 3, about 120 something. So we have now a preview of what that might look like, and it's going to be much slower. Now maybe it's too slow, so we could actually do something like just 2 here on the tweens. There you go. I'm starting to like this, right? So one thing we could do is now also make it a little bit better quality even, reducing the fudge factor here to some extent, maybe just 1 or 2. That will be 1 pass. And it's getting slower because it's thinking harder and looking for more numbers to crunch. But then what you do is you uncheck the dry run, and you do even more of a refinement pass. And then at that point, it's going to go think about it even harder and probably get you an even better result. So I'm going to go do that. And it's not time for coffee. It's going to be fast enough, but yeah, you can tell it is definitely going a little bit slower. And at that point, you have an animation that should be really clean, except for the last frame. Actually, the very first frame. It's usually, that's a side effect of the motion prediction module. The motion estimated interpolation has a side effect where the last frame is replicated to the front. So this one is done, but when you go and look here, the very first frame is actually a replica of the last frame. But because this is a looping animation, you just may not notice, right? The frames are replicated at the same position. You just don't notice. The only side effect it might have, if there was fast movement, you might notice that it kind of stutters and holds it for a fraction of a second. But because it's really not, yeah, because it's really not that dramatic a change or movement, you just don't notice it, and now we have a nice animation there. It might be one where, let's say, for instance, if we do have a little bit of an artifact on the last couple of frames, you could still do some more of what we did earlier, which is right-click it and make it loopable again, right? So you could say, well, we have now 60 frames and or 80, and that's too long. We wanted it somewhere around 2 seconds total, so about 60 frames if we play it at 30 frames per second. Right, so that would be a good place to go. So let's do that. Although I think I probably overlapped too much now, and it's going to look a little bit like a fade over when we play it. Right? And that's why it's important to also save often in between different stages of your project. Save it or at least store it on disk so that if anything goes bad, you can recover it and find it and continue again. So I have an animation here that's pretty neat, and it's loopable. And I could see doing a few other things. For instance, I might want to blur it a little bit in the background and keep it crisp in the front. Right, so that's also an option here. One really easy way to do that, since there isn't a whole lot of movement here, vertically speaking, I can simply do a delimiter, change right-click on this tool with the gradients, and there is a selection fader. And so what you could do is simply say, okay, I'm going to keep it crisp in the front, and then go select to the back to disappear, right? And so that selection allows you to now say, well, I'm going to keep it sharpening here and not sharpening there, or invert the selection and then blur it here and keep it as is in the front, right? So there's a couple of different ways to skin this baby here. I'm going to go, for instance, maybe I want to blur it in the foreground and keep it crisp in the background. Right, so I'm going to go select roughly from here, going down, something like that. And right now I can sharpen it in the background. I want to do that a little bit. So filter, sharpen. This one is really good too. Digital photo enhance definitely has been one of my favorites so far, but for this type of scenario. But the high pass sharpen is really interesting too nowadays, so you might occasionally find this one even better. It's new in Howler 2022. So let's say if you need this and a little bit extreme sharpening, you could do that and animate it. So now the mask that we have here is preventing the sharpening in the foreground, and there's a gradual transition where it's happening. This line you see here is not the do all or cut all delimitation. This is the 50% line, right? This is where it's half selected or half not selected, depending on which way you look at it, right? So on this side, everything is selected, and then there is a transition. At 50%, you see this marching ants line, and then it goes and eventually disappears into non-selected at all. And so the filter hasn't been applied here, but it is sharpening here. We can do another one if we want to extreme, if you want to sharpen it extremely. For instance, here the digital photo enhance, I'm going to use that one with the HSV, hue saturation value mode. And then here you could do a little bit too much of it or just a little bit better, something like that, and animate that. So now we have that filtering applying again on each frame of the animation, but through the mask, mostly on or only on the upper half of the picture. And then we want to blur, do the opposite, blur the bottom side. So I'm going to go and reverse the filter selection, the mask, invert selection. There it is. And by the way, you might want to store that selection. That would be another way to do it. You can invert it right here and then replace it. Boom, now we have the opposite there too. So that's another way to get the same. And now I want to do the bokeh blur here. Bokeh blur. That's the nice one here where you can get a little bit of a blurring effect at the same time as maybe some bloom. something like that. Yeah, let's make it extreme. Let's go like this, okay, and animate that. And so now we have a combination, right? In the back, it's nicely crisp and sharp. In the foreground, it's blurry, and we have a transition. Let's go clear that selection. And here is our finished animation. If it ever is finished, right? Whoa, now we see a little bit of a aliasing effect here. We probably did too much of that blurring or sharpening, actually. This is a side effect of doing too much of it, right? Now, so that's one way it could call possibly for some extra filtering, where you could, stretch it and blend it again, right? So that's typically something like this here, time stretch, and initially go up and then go back down in the number of frames. So that will blend them together and even it out a little bit. For instance, you could do, instead of 60 frames, you could do 123. Make sure you have the frame blending on here. Apply that. And then if you look at it here, it still has a little bit of that, of course. But now you can go right click and time stretch the other way. And maybe do that in 2 or 3 stages. Instead of going back down to 60 directly, maybe go down to 80 and then 60 and maybe even below. Let's say you're going to play this at 24 frames a second, maybe 48 is the target. In fact, I'm going to try that. I'm going to go 48 right there. Make sure it still has the frame blending. So now I have 48 frames. Yeah, it still has a little bit of that. Some of that might also be due to the zooming in or zooming out, right? But that side effect is something you shouldn't see if you don't if you don't overdo it with the sharpening. I clearly did too much on that sharpening, and that's one of the high filter side effects there. So anyway, hope to give you some ideas on how you can make some looping animations, even add some breathing room, so to speak, some breathing motion to that, thanks to the timeline editor that you see here. And by the way, the timeline editor has a copy of all these frames if you had this thing checked, right? So that's another little tip. If you need to revert after applying all these filters and effects, what you could do is you can restore it. You can click undo, and it should bring those frames back right in there. Right? So now you have, well, maybe you have a few frames from the longer animation here at the very end. You can simply delete those. Right? So I'm going to delete that one, this one more, this one more. Boom. And now I'm back to a fairly usable starting point. No movement yet, no breathing, but I have at least gotten rid of all the filters that were sharpening too much or blurring not enough and stuff like that. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is that you have stored copies. If you do that, if you store your animation, you will have the luxury of going back in time and restoring some of these earlier stages before something got out of control with too much filtering, perhaps. But you also have one level of undo you can do from the timeline editor if you did go into the timeline editor and rendered something. Right? If you applied it, then there is a safe copy of all these frames just as and before they get transformed. So that's another place you can go to if you want to quickly revert to that old location. All right, well, thank you very much for watching. That's all for this one, and hope it inspires. See you next time.